It was a quiet Friday night in a small town. Jenna had just moved there for work, and she didn't know anyone yet. After unpacking her boxes all day, she felt too tired to cook. She decided to explore the town and find a place to eat. Walking down the empty streets, Jenna noticed an old diner at the edge of town. The neon sign buzzed softly, spelling out Hollow Hill Diner in flickering red and blue letters. The building looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but something about it felt strangely inviting. As she stepped inside, a small bell above the door jingled. The interior was dimly lit, with red vinyl booths and black and white tiled floors. A jukebox sat in the corner, though it was silent. Behind the counter, an older man wearing a white apron greeted her with a warm smile. "Evening, miss," he said. "What can I get you?" Jenna glanced at the menu on the wall. The prices were surprisingly cheap, and the dishes sounded simple but tasty. "I'll take a cheeseburger and fries," she said, settling into a booth by the window. The man nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Jenna looked around. The diner was almost empty, except for a couple sitting in a booth near the back. They were whispering to each other, their faces serious. Occasionally, they glanced nervously toward the kitchen. A chill ran down Jenna's spine, but she shook it off. "It's just an old diner," she told herself. After a few minutes, the man returned with her food. The burger smelled delicious, and the fries were perfectly golden. "Enjoy," he said with a smile before returning to the counter. Jenna took a bite, and the flavors were incredible, far better than she expected. But as she ate, she started to notice strange things. The couple in the back whispered more urgently now, and the woman's eyes darted around the room. The jukebox flickered to life for a moment, playing a few distorted notes before going silent again. Jenna decided to ignore it. "It's probably just my imagination," she thought. As she finished her meal, she realized she was the only customer left. The couple had left without her noticing, and the diner felt eerily quiet. She went to the counter to pay, but the older man was gone. Instead, a teenage boy stood there, his face pale and anxious. How much do I owe you?" Jenna asked. The boy stared at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should leave, now." Jenna froze. "What? Why?" Before the boy could answer, the lights flickered, and a loud crash came from the kitchen. The boy's eyes widened. "Go," he hissed. "They don't like it when people stay too long." Jenna grabbed her purse and ran to the door. As she pushed it open, she glanced back. The kitchen door swung open, and for a brief second, she saw something inhuman, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. She didn't wait to see more. She sprinted out of the diner and didn't stop until she reached her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys. Once inside, she locked the doors and drove away as fast as she could. In her rearview mirror, the diner's neon sign flickered one last time before going dark. The next day, Jenna tried to find information about the Hollow Hill Diner. She asked her coworkers, but they gave her confused looks. "That diner closed years ago," one of them said. "It burned down after a kitchen accident." Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what she had seen, and it wasn't her imagination. To this day, she avoids that part of town, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, she swears she can smell burgers and fries. Jenna couldn't shake the events of that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure in the kitchen. Its red eyes burned into her memory, and the teenage boy's panicked voice echoed in her ears. "They don't like it when people stay too long." That night, sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, haunted by the strange encounter. Around 3 a.m., Jenna finally drifted into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before she was awakened by an odd sound, something tapping against her window. Her apartment was on the second floor. Heart racing, she sat up in bed and stared at the window. It was too dark to see clearly, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Gathering her courage, Jenna crept to the window and peeked out from behind the curtain. Her breath caught in her throat. There was nothing there, just the empty street below. But as she turned to go back to bed, she noticed something chilling. On the glass, written in faint streaks of condensation, were the words, "You shouldn't have come." She backed away, her hands shaking. Had someone been outside her window? But how could they leave a message like that without a ladder? Jenna spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, clutching her phone. The next morning, Jenna was determined to find answers. She returned to her coworkers during lunch. "Are you sure the Hollow Hill Diner burned down?" she asked. They exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, a woman named Grace spoke up. "It's not something people like to talk about," she said. "There were stories about that place before the fire. Strange things happening there, people going missing." Jenna's stomach churned. "Like what?" she asked. Grace leaned in, lowering her voice. "Some said the owners were involved in something dark, rituals, sacrifices. Others said the diner itself was cursed. After the fire, no one wanted to rebuild. It's just an empty lot now." Jenna's mind raced. She had seen the diner with her own eyes. She had eaten there, talked to the staff. "Is anyone still alive who worked there?" Jenna asked. Grace hesitated. "Maybe. I heard one of the old employees moved to a town a few miles away. His name was Earl, but good luck getting him to talk about it." That afternoon, Jenna found herself driving to the neighboring town, following Grace's directions to Earl's house. It was a small, run-down place on the edge of a wooded area. Earl answered the door after her third knock. He was an older man with graying hair and a nervous demeanor. "What do you want?" he asked, squinting at her. "I need to ask you about the Hollow Hill Diner," Jenna said. Earl's face darkened, and he tried to shut the door, but Jenna caught it with her hand. "Please," she pleaded. "I was there last night. I need to know what's going on." Earl froze. His eyes widened, and he looked her over carefully. "You were there?" he whispered. "Yes," Jenna said. "But it doesn't make sense. I was told the diner burned down years ago." Earl let out a shaky breath and gestured for her to come inside. Inside, Earl poured himself a drink and sat down at the kitchen table. He stared into his glass for a long moment before speaking. "The diner didn't just burn down," he said finally. "It consumed itself." "What does that mean?" Jenna asked, sitting across from him. Earl sighed. "The Hollow Hill Diner wasn't normal. I worked there for a few months before the fire, and strange things kept happening. People would come in, eat their meals, and leave, but they were never quite the same. Some would disappear entirely." Jenna's heart pounded. "I think the diner was alive," Earl continued. "It fed on people, not their bodies, but something else, their souls maybe. And the owners. They knew. They encouraged it." "Why didn't you leave?" Jenna asked. Earl looked away. "By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The diner doesn't let everyone leave. When it burned down, I thought it was finally over." Jenna told him about her visit, the glowing eyes in the kitchen, and the message on her window. Earl paled. "It's not over," he said quietly. "If you were there, it means the diner isn't gone. It's trapped between worlds, waiting for people to stumble in. You were lucky to get out alive." "What do I do now?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking. Earl hesitated. "Don't go back. Don't try to fight it. Just forget it ever happened." Jenna tried to take Earl's advice, but the diner wouldn't let her go. The next few nights, she felt its presence everywhere, in the shadows of her apartment, in her dreams. She woke up each morning feeling more drained, as if something was siphoning her energy. The final straw came when she found a piece of paper on her kitchen table. She hadn't put it there. Written in the same eerie handwriting as the window message were 3 words, "Come back soon." Terrified but determined, Jenna knew she had no choice. The only way to end this was to confront the diner head-on. In the small town of Groveside, there was a restaurant called the Crimson Table. Nobody remembered when it first opened, but it was a local landmark. The sign above the door had faded letters, and its bright red front door was always spotless, as though freshly painted. The town residents whispered stories about the place, though most dismissed them as rumors. Lila, a college student who had just moved to Groveside, worked a part-time job at a library. She often heard customers talk about the Crimson Table. People raved about its food, the best in the county, they claimed. But their tones always hinted at something deeper, like they were both proud and afraid of the restaurant. Lila wasn't much for gossip, but curiosity eventually got the better of her. One Friday night, feeling adventurous, she decided to go there. When Lila arrived, she was surprised to find the restaurant almost empty. The interior had a vintage charm, with polished wooden floors, elegant chandeliers, and crimson tablecloths on each table. It was warm and inviting, yet something about the stillness of the place unsettled her. The hostess greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Table for one?" the woman asked. "Yes," Lila replied. The hostess led her to a corner table near the back of the restaurant. Strangely, the crimson tablecloth on her table looked slightly darker than the others, almost wet. When Lila reached out to touch it, she found the fabric dry, but a metallic smell lingered in the air, faint yet sharp. "Your server will be with you shortly," the hostess said, and left before Lila could respond. The air in the restaurant felt heavy. Though there were no windows, a strange, cool draft seemed to sweep through the room every few minutes. Lila scanned the place. There were only a few other diners, an elderly couple speaking in hushed tones and a man eating alone, staring at his plate with a blank expression. Lila felt an itch of unease. She decided to focus on the menu instead. The menu was strange. It had typical dishes like roast chicken, steak, and pasta, but the descriptions were oddly specific. Rosemary chicken, seasoned with the zest of life. Filet mignon, tender as an old memory. House pasta, tangled like forgotten dreams. Shrugging, Lila ordered the filet mignon. The server, a gaunt, silent man with deep-set eyes, nodded and disappeared into the kitchen without saying a word. When the dish arrived, Lila was amazed. The steak looked perfect, almost unreal. The smell was intoxicating, and the first bite was unlike anything she had ever tasted. It was savory and rich, and each bite filled her with a strange sense of nostalgia. Memories flooded her mind. She saw images of her childhood home, her late grandmother's smile, and even her first pet. The food made her feel warmth and longing, but it was almost too intense, like someone was prying her memories apart. Suddenly, Lila realized something disturbing. Her knife had sliced through the steak effortlessly, but there were no grill marks on the meat, and its color was deep red, as though it hadn't been cooked at all. Her appetite vanished. She pushed the plate aside and glanced around. The elderly couple was gone, and the lone man had left his table, but his meal remained untouched. Lila could see his table from her seat. A fly buzzed above his dish, and when it landed on the food, it immediately fell dead. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" a deep voice asked. Lila jumped. A tall, well-dressed man with dark, piercing eyes stood at her table. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly under the chandelier's light. He smiled, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "I'm sorry," Lila stammered. "The steak was good, but I think I've lost my appetite." The man's smile didn't waver. "We take great care in preparing our dishes. Each one is special, unique even. I hope you understand." Lila nodded awkwardly, eager to leave. She placed her credit card on the table, but the man gently pushed it back toward her. "Your meal has been paid," he said, "a gift for first-time diners." "That's generous," Lila said, though she felt far from grateful. The man leaned closer, his smile now unsettling. "Generosity is part of what makes us memorable. We hope you'll return." Lila gave a polite nod, grabbed her purse, and left as quickly as she could. Back in her apartment, Lila couldn't stop thinking about the restaurant. Despite the unease she felt, part of her wanted to go back. The taste of the steak lingered in her mind, and she found herself craving it. That night, she had strange dreams. She saw herself sitting in the crimson table again, surrounded by shadows that whispered her name. The tall man stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. In his other hand, He held a plate of raw meat. When she woke up, Lila's heart was racing. She told herself it was just a dream, but something felt wrong. In the days that followed, her appetite vanished. She tried eating her favorite foods, pizza, burgers, pasta, but they all tasted bland. Even drinking water left a metallic taste in her mouth. The only thing she wanted was the steak from the Crimson Table. Desperate for answers, Lila searched the internet for information about the restaurant. She found nothing. No official website, no reviews, no mention of it at all. Frustrated, she turned to the town's archives at the library. In an old newspaper from 1982, she found a single article, "Local eatery owner missing after allegations of dark practices." The article described a man named Edwin Holt, the original owner of the Crimson Table. According to the report, Edwin's business was booming, but many in the town believed he was involved in occult practices. Customers claimed to feel drained after eating at his restaurant, and several people went missing. The final line of the article chilled Lila to the core. Edwin Holt vanished without a trace, but witnesses claim they saw him walking back into his restaurant one last time. That night, the red door closed, and it hasn't opened for anyone else but him since. Unable to resist the pull of her cravings, Lila returned to the Crimson Table 1 week later. This time, the place was even emptier than before. As soon as she walked in, the tall man was there, waiting for her. "Welcome back," he said, his sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. I don't know why I'm here," Lila admitted, her voice trembling. The man's smile widened. "I think you do." He led her to the same table as before, the one with the darker red cloth. "I'll prepare something special for you," he said, disappearing into the kitchen. When he returned, he placed a silver platter in front of her. Lila lifted the lid and gasped. The meat on the plate wasn't steak, it was raw, and its texture looked disturbingly familiar. It pulsed faintly, like something alive. "Eat," the man commanded. "I can't," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You already have," he said. Horrified, Lila realized the metallic taste in her mouth and her lack of appetite were because of the food she ate the first time. It wasn't just food, it was a part of her. As the realization dawned, the red cloth beneath her hands began to seep and spread, staining her fingers. The room darkened, and the man's smile was the last thing she saw. Days passed, but Lila was no longer the same. Her dreams were consumed by images of the Crimson Table, its red door calling to her. She tried to eat normal food, but nothing stayed down. Water burned her throat, and any food she tried to swallow tasted like ash. Her body grew weaker, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. One night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth in an attempt to rid herself of the metallic taste that had plagued her since her last visit. As she leaned closer to spit, she noticed something horrifying. Her gums were bleeding, not just oozing blood but pouring it, thick and dark. It tasted familiar, just like the steak from the Crimson Table. Panicked, she stumbled back, hitting the sink. She stared at her reflection and screamed. Her lips, her tongue, her teeth, they were crimson, stained as if she'd been feasting on raw meat. Desperation drove her back to the archives, hoping to find something, anything that could save her. The local history books revealed that Groveside had long been associated with strange disappearances. The Crimson Table, it seemed, was at the center of these events for over a century. But this time, Lila found something new, an account written by someone claiming to have escaped the restaurant's grip. The passage was barely legible, but one line stood out. "The table's grip only weakens when the offering is denied." It wasn't clear what it meant, but Lila felt a glimmer of hope. She returned to the Crimson Table, this time prepared. Tucked inside her purse was a small bottle of gasoline and a lighter. The restaurant looked unchanged as she approached, its crimson door glowing faintly under the streetlights. Steeling herself, she stepped inside. This time, the dining room was completely empty. No customers, no waitstaff, just an eerie silence. Yet she felt watched, like dozens of unseen eyes were following her every move. The tall man appeared without warning, his grin as unnerving as ever. "Welcome back," he said, his voice soft but resonant. Lila glared at him. "What did you do to me?" "I gave you a gift," he replied smoothly, gesturing toward the back of the restaurant. "Come, let me show you." Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the kitchen. Something compelled her to follow. The kitchen was unlike anything Lila had imagined. It wasn't bright and bustling like most restaurant kitchens. Instead, it was cavernous, dark, and lined with strange machinery. Pipes ran across the walls, dripping a thick red liquid into glass jars. In the center of the room was a large, circular table, covered in more of the same crimson fabric. Her eyes widened when she saw what was on the table, a heart, still beating. It throbbed in slow, deliberate pulses as though alive. "What is this?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of the table," the man said, circling around it like a predator. "It keeps this place alive. It feeds on those who come here, their joy, their sorrow, their lives. And it gives back, doesn't it? A taste that stays with you forever." "That's why nothing tastes right anymore," Lila said, her stomach churning. "You've taken something from me." "Yes," the man admitted, his grin widening. "And yet you returned. They always return." Lila reached into her purse, her hand trembling. Before the man could react, she uncapped the bottle of gasoline and hurled it onto the table. The liquid splashed across the heart and the crimson fabric, soaking the room in its sharp, acrid smell. The man's smile vanished. "What are you doing?" "I'm ending this," Lila said, pulling out the lighter. The man's expression darkened. "Do you think you can defy it? The table cannot die. It's part of you now, as much as you are part of it. Then we'll burn together," Lila snapped, striking the lighter. The small flame flickered to life in her hands. She hesitated for only a moment before throwing it onto the table. The flames erupted instantly, engulfing the heart and spreading across the room. The man let out an inhuman scream as his flesh began to burn, revealing something monstrous beneath, a shadowy form with red eyes and jagged teeth. The restaurant groaned as the fire consumed it, the walls trembling like a living thing in pain. Lila stumbled back toward the exit, choking on the smoke and heat. As she reached the door, she turned to see the man, no, the creature, standing in the midst of the flames. His body was disintegrating, but his glowing eyes locked onto hers. "You can't escape," he rasped. "The table never lets go." With a final guttural roar, he was consumed by the fire. Lila collapsed outside the building, coughing and gasping for air. By the time the fire department arrived, the restaurant was gone, reduced to smoldering rubble. For weeks after, she avoided the area, terrified that the red door might reappear. But as time passed, the cravings faded, her appetite returned, and her life began to feel normal again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. One night, months later, she found an envelope on her kitchen table. She didn't know how it had gotten there, but the crimson seal on the back was unmistakable. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a single card that read, "You've denied the offering, but the table always waits." Lila's blood ran cold. Somewhere, in some form, the crimson table would return, and when it did, it would be waiting for her. After receiving the envelope, Lila's life took a darker turn. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, even in the safety of her apartment. Objects seemed to move on their own. Subtle things. A chair slightly out of place. A cupboard left open that she was sure she'd closed. Her appetite, though briefly returned, began to falter again. Food tasted lifeless, her meals became smaller, and soon she was subsisting on scraps just to keep herself alive. The metallic taste from before returned, stronger this time, as if the table's grip on her had strengthened. Her dreams became more vivid and terrifying. Every night she found herself seated at a crimson table in a vast, empty void. A plate of food would appear before her, raw, pulsating, and faintly glowing. Each time she refused to eat, The void around her would shrink, pressing tighter and tighter until she woke up gasping for air. One evening, desperate for normalcy, Lila invited her coworker Elise to dinner at her apartment. Elise, cheerful and chatty, seemed like the perfect distraction from the creeping horrors of Lila's life. As they sat down to eat a simple pasta dish, Elise suddenly frowned and sniffed the air. "What's that smell?" she asked. Lila froze. "What smell?" Elise hesitated. "It smells metallic, like bee blood." Lila's stomach turned. "It's nothing," she said quickly, trying to change the subject. But Elise continued to glance around the room uneasily. Then, halfway through the meal, she dropped her fork with a startled gasp. "Lila," Elise said, pointing to the corner of the room. "Who's that?" Lila turned sharply, but the corner was empty. "There's no one there," she whispered, though her heart raced. "I swear," Elise said, her voice trembling, "there was someone standing right there. A man. Tall, with pale skin." The blood drained from Lila's face. She grabbed Elise's hand. "You need to leave. Now." Elise didn't argue. She grabbed her coat and left without looking back, leaving Lila alone with the growing shadows in her apartment. That night, Lila bolted her doors and windows, double-checking each lock before collapsing into bed. Sleep came in uneasy waves, and when she woke in the middle of the night, it was to a familiar smell: smoke. She panicked and saw a glow seeping through the cracks of her bedroom door. Her first thought was fire, but when she opened the door, she found something worse. In the center of her living room stood a single red door, exactly like the one at the crimson table. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. I burned it down." But the door was undeniable, solid and waiting. A faint scratching sound came from the other side, like nails raking against wood. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward and placed her hand on the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally so, and sent a shiver up her arm. The scratching stopped. "Don't," a voice whispered behind her. She turned, but no one was there. The voice came again, softer this time. "Don't open it." Despite the warning, Lila twisted the knob and opened the door. On the other side wasn't her apartment building or anything familiar. She was back in the crimson table, but it was different now. The dining hall was massive, stretching endlessly into the darkness, and the crimson tablecloths shimmered like pools of blood. The tall man stood in the center of the room, his face pale and hollow. He smiled that same sharp-toothed grin. "You tried to destroy what cannot die," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But the table remembers. The table waits." "I don't belong here," Lila yelled, stepping back. "You can't take me." He tilted his head. "You already belong. You've eaten from the table, and you'll always hunger for it. Sit and let the hunger end." A chair appeared behind her, and invisible hands pushed her into it. The table stretched out before her, and on it sat a single plate. This time, there was no steak. The meat on the plate was raw and dripping, but its texture wasn't just flesh. It looked disturbingly human, fingers curled within the mess, a faint impression of a face in the folds. Lila screamed. The man leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "Eat and the pain ends. You'll be part of us. You'll never hunger again." Lila shook her head. "I won't," he frowned. "Then the table will take what it's owed another way, one piece at a time." The shadows around her closed in, tightening their grip, and Lila felt a sharp, searing pain in her chest. She looked down and saw her own reflection in the polished surface of the table, her image growing paler, gaunter. Her strength was fading, being siphoned by the table itself. She clutched the edge, her fingernails splintering against the wood. "No," she gasped. "You don't control me." Forcing herself to move, Lila reached for the plate and hurled it off the table. The food splattered onto the floor, and the shadows around her recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek. The man's grin faltered, and for the first time, he looked unsure. "You deny the table again?" he hissed. "Do you think that frees you?" Lila pushed herself to her feet. "I think I free myself, Grabbing the nearest candlestick, she threw it into the crimson tablecloth, setting it ablaze. The flames caught instantly, and the entire room was soon consumed by fire. The man screamed as his form flickered and dissolved into the shadows, and the endless dining hall began to collapse. Lila ran for the red door, smoke and ash choking her as the walls caved in around her. She stumbled through the door and slammed it shut behind her, collapsing onto her apartment floor. When Lila woke up, the door was gone. Her living room was intact, and sunlight streamed through the window. For the first time in weeks, she felt light, free. The metallic taste in her mouth was gone, and she could breathe easily. But deep down, she knew the table wasn't gone forever. It would return, waiting for someone else to sit, someone else to hunger. And she vowed never to forget that chilling truth. The crimson table always waits.